Five, four, three, two, one.
All right. Hello, willkommen, bienvenue, konnichiwa, ni hao, jambo, marhaba. It's time for the Armist Inquisition yet again. Episode 281 on Sunday, the 21st of May, 2023. I'm Phil.
I'm Ben.
I'm Matt.
And tonight we are joined by Michael Le Flem. How you doing, Michael?
Appreciate the intro. You're hitting on all of my favorites: Steve Brule, Dr. Grant.
You're loving it, aren't you?
Yeah.
Michael, you've just written this book, and I've got a screen grab here. Here it comes, Visions of Atlantis, claiming
yes.
our lost ancient legacy. And
there
now,
it is.
I was just saying before, I've just finished it today.
Now, how long have you been in therapy since finishing it? How's that going?
I want to say, Michael, like some books are a real slog to get through, and I'm terrible. I can't abandon a book. I will always see it through to the end. And I remember last year, the year before, I was reading some weird Uspensky book or something, and it absolutely murdered me.
Oh, wow.
It must have took me about 3 or 4 months to read it because it was horrific, and I hated every minute of it.
Was it Tertium Organum?
No, it wasn't. I've got that one. It was The Fourth Way.
Whoa, wow. Yeah. I don't blame you. I mean, those are really difficult, dense books. I mean, the fact that you finished that, I don't think I've finished that book. That's a difficult book. Yeah.
What I was getting to is that it's always a good sign when you whip through a book. It's always a good sign that it's well written and it's engaging. And, you know, I didn't feel pressured to finish it just because you were coming on. I wanted to finish it because I wanted to sort of find out. I was going to say what conclusions you draw from the book, but one of the things I liked about it is that you don't you're not sort of pushing. You're not pushing a certain worldview or ideology or anything. You're just sort of letting the evidence speak for itself.
Well, that's really great that came across because I I worked really hard to get that tone. I thought that was probably just as hard as collating all the evidence and putting this thing together was achieving that. So that's a supreme compliment to me, you know, because, you know, part of the reason I really wrote this book, I think one of the main reasons was precisely that. There have been so many books on both sides, the debunking side and the true believer side, and then within the various subfields, you know, Atlantis in Antarctica, Atlantis in the Mediterranean, Atlantis in the Mid-Atlantic. And it didn't really seem that the debate was moving anywhere. It just seemed like everybody had their little kingdom, not just for this subject, but for really any kind of ancient history subject that kind of went beyond the mainstream, you know, purview, especially when you start talking about ancient aliens or, you know, anything on that level. I really felt like it was time for not just an update with new evidence, but a new tone to the debate, you know, that it was not the domain of one person to declare once and for all that case closed, that it's an open story that is worthy of investigation. It should be taken just as seriously as we take any ancient subject, but that you have to toe a, you know, very balanced line so that people don't get offended and lose interest. And you also have to make, you know, what can be quite dry, extremely boring material interesting, you know, and keep it going. So I'm glad that was achieved. That's a really nice thing to hear.
Yeah, and I liked sort of the historical perspective that you sort of peppered in. There's a lot of sort of straight. Well, I don't know if straight history is the right word, but you know, you tell us bits about the Roman Empire and early Judaism. The sacking of the temple, I think, was in there mentioned, and there's all sorts of background history peppered throughout the book, which I always like.
Yeah, I don't think I can help that. That's always that's the way I was trained. I was trained as a specifically as an intellectual historian, and people, I guess, that come from that discipline is kind of a weird specific discipline where you study the history of philosophy and kind of historical trends, but you study it in a context that's not removed from the time in which these concepts emerge. So we would never study just Plato, here's the Republic, and read the book as a isolated incident. You'd have to see, well, what was the economy of Greece or Athens at that time doing that would produce those ideas? What were the socio, cultural aspects? What were the religious aspects? And it really, I guess, was just something that I became kind of like subconsciously attuned to, because that's where how I was trained. That's who I studied under. My mentors were both intellectual historians, and so I don't know how to do it any other way,
Yeah.
And I can't just write a book that said Edgar Cayce said this without telling you, well, what was going on in the early 20th century in the time that would produce an Edgar Cayce, and so on and so forth. So that's interesting.
It might be worth telling us a bit about your background, your sort of educational background, and because once you bring up, if you start talking about Edgar Cayce and Atlantis, and immediately a certain subset of people will be completely switched off. It just does not comply with the worldview.
Yeah, of course.
So it might be useful to hear a bit about your sort of educational background and what led you in this path of discovery.
Yeah, well, for somebody who wrote a book about clairvoyant impressions of Atlantis, I'm not the person that you would expect to do it. I was a quite conventional, professional historian of World War II and United States clandestine operations and foreign policy. That's my master's degree is in that subject.
Wow.
But I guess just through teaching a few survey courses over the years, I was a college professor for 12 years in Chicago, and you'd have to engage with ancient history and study the rise of civilization and things like that, and kind of go beyond what you were trained in, because now you're the teacher and you've got to be an authority. So when I started to look at these timelines, just the anthropological timeline, for example, when I would teach a world history or human nature survey course, and you would start with, say, the purported emergence of Homo sapiens 250,000 years ago, and then this bizarre dead zone where apparently nothing happens for another 193,000 years. And then suddenly you have the simultaneous emergence of, quite advanced comparatively civilizations in Egypt, Sumer, parts of India, China. And then you have the simultaneous emergence of, quite similar philosophies, even in terms of, and if you look at the golden age of, if you look at the time Taoism emerges and the time of Buddhism emerges and things like this, and it started to really kind of make me wonder, like, what did really go on in this time that anthropologists say there were people who had the same mental capacities, essentially the same brain capacity, skeletal structure as us, and this, let's say, fertile crescent emergence of civilization time. And of course, if you go back to that dark, the dead zone, as I call it in the book, I think you inevitably run up against the question of Atlantis, because this is a classic story. And I stress story, not legend or myth, because Plato specifically says this is not a myth. And I always love to tell people that when they say, you believe in the legend of Atlantis, I say, no, I believe in Plato and what he wrote. And let's just check what he wrote, because we seem to think that, 99% of everything else he said was the work of a genius, but suddenly he's wrong on that. And it leads you down a very kind of predictable trail. If you follow his clues, it leads you to Egypt right off the bat, because that's where he gets the story in his own dialogue. He gets it from Solon. Solon gets it from the temple priests in Lower Egypt and Sais. And then that leads you, okay, well, let's look deeper into pre-dynastic Egypt and so on and so forth. But you always run up against this kind of dead zone. Even the ancient records, let's say the Egyptian records, it's like even their own pre-dynastic records only go back few, depending on how people translate certain hieroglyphs, 18,000 BC or something like that. Let's say, on an extreme level of what certain people have interpreted. And so you really start wondering, like, could there have really been something around at that time? And the only way to get a picture or a vision, if you will, of what that reality would have even looked like is through clairvoyance or through remote viewing, and really looking at what do multiple accounts that have no way of corroborating with each other through different periods of time. And to me, the best ones being ones that were very early, before any analog to that kind of technology even existed, which, for me is not proof. It's just another layer to the story. It adds a little bit of color to a otherwise quite dry archaeological, very loose, difficult to tie together story. It actually pieces it together quite beautifully, and I think actually successfully answers the question of, could there have been this thing back then? And I think absolutely. After having studied it for 7-8 years, I could almost certainly say, yes, this is a lived reality. I don't claim to know exactly what it was like, but sure,
It kind of reminds me, you remember when we had Chris Tolworthy on talking about Atlantis, and there was this sort of idea that anything before written history, where we have written records, is kind of devalued. Sort of things like oral tradition that's been passed down and such. And these stories, myths, however you want to describe them, there seems to be this dividing line that as soon as we get written history, then all of a sudden we can take all this serious. And it's like, I mean, what do we know about people and writing history and who writes the history? It's like, why do we put so much weight in what people who were in charge were writing, 2,000 years ago? But we completely disregard things like oral traditions from North American tribes or ancient Egypt or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find it so interesting that, when people, it's what really was so interesting to me was to see, because, I look at this book as like, it's really like 5 books crammed into one, to me, because yeah, of course, it's a book on clairvoyant images of Atlantis, but it's also a history of, in this case, one of those 5 qualities would be, it's a study for the layperson of just what you just said, like how the historical profession works and how it cherry picks what it wants to fit its current historical timeline. And for example, today, you will be really hard pressed to find Scientific American or National Geographic write a serious, objective, unbiased article, even suggesting the reality of, let's say, Atlantis or any prehistoric, civilization. They have a hard enough time even giving Göbekli Tepe the place it deserves, which has already conclusively rewritten the whole hunter-gatherer BS story that we've all been force-fed for the past, 50 years. But if you go back to 1877, for example, when the ship Challenger mapped or did soundings and discovered the mid-Atlantic ridge, they wrote an article, not as esoteric scientists, not as people who meditate with crystals, as hardcore oceanographers at the top of their profession who were selected to chart the mid-Atlantic region for militaries and governments of the world. And the first thing they said was, You know, that story that Plato was told by Solon actually now makes a lot more sense because multiple lines of evidence are converging, suggesting that Atlantis probably was exactly here because we read the dialogue and that's where the mid-Atlantic ridge is. They didn't say we found Atlantis. They just said, actually, if we're being objective, there is a large sunken landmass off the coast of Portugal, right where Plato said it was. That's quite interesting. But it's like somehow we've forgotten that. And, you know, now you're crazy if you tell people that the mid-Atlantic ridge exists. Like when people say, well, where is it? I always say, go to my website, look at the top left picture. It's a picture of the ocean floors with all the water drained out of them. There's a giant goddamn continent in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. You don't have to really look that hard, you know? It's really not that difficult, you know? And I get emails all the time from people that love to make it more complicated than it is. Oh, the Straits of Gibraltar are not the Pillars of Hercules. He was actually talking, and it's like, bro, read the damn dialogue. Read it again. Because if the Pillars of Hercules are the Straits of Gibraltar in every other time they're used in ancient Greek to describe that, but they just, nah, it's not this time. It's actually Malta or it's Sicily.
Cyprus, yeah, Sicily, yeah.
Or it's the island of Thera. And it's like, well, that's interesting because the island of Thera did have an eruption 8,000 years after the time Plato's describing it. Okay, he's not describing the Bronze Age. He's actually, again, if this is all made up, it's quite interesting that he picks the date 9600 BC when he's writing from 360 BC. That's a quite accurate guess if this is a fable, because we know that that was the end of the Younger Dryas period and the beginning of the Holocene. So it's like somehow he knew that, or the Egyptians knew it, but they're not a creditable source. You know, the oldest culture that keeps records, they're not really trustworthy. You know, a guy who, you know, got a degree from a liberal arts college who doesn't speak the language and, you know, has never done field work, that's a reliable authority because, you know, we all know nobody believes in Atlantis anymore. You know, and it's just quite interesting to see this shift, which is quite recent. You know, it's really, to me, in the last 25, maybe 30 years that this became like a silly topic. But until really the early 90s, this was not a silly topic. Almost most serious academics didn't discredit this kind of thing outright.
Do you think that's a backlash? Because, you know, Fingerprints of the Gods came out in what, 94, 95?
95. 95 and 96, yeah.
I don't
know. That's right.
Did von Daniken's book, Charity of the Gods, that would have been earlier, I guess, wouldn't it? Maybe.
Yeah, that was much earlier. 70s, I think that was even like 78, 77, yeah.
Yeah, but there's obviously been a growth. Charles Berlitz did one in the 80s, which was very popular. And I'm just wondering whether, because these books have been so popular and they're not written by what you would call accredited historians or archaeologists, that's what's maybe forced this backlash in the last couple of decades.
Yeah, I think, you know, to go through each of those, absolutely. I mean, I think, of course, Hancock is the classic example. You know, he's a guy who was a travel journalist at the, you know, what was it, the London...
Economist, I think.
Yeah, you know, and, you know, on his assignment in Ethiopia decides to look for the Ark of the Covenant, and it's like, how dare you go off script? You know, you're supposed to be writing about, you know, Mogadishu port or whatever. But it is quite interesting. And he did write a great book on Mogadishu. But it's like, yeah, it's interesting that, you know, and it's quite funny to me because the people that hold this quote unquote authority, like Egyptologists, it's like, okay, I don't consider myself an Atlantologist. I would never presume that, you know. I'm a historian, you know, that's what I was trained to do. I have a master's degree in history. I was a adjunct professor. I'm just a curious person, you know, that likes to write and talk to people. But I find it funny that, you know, when somebody like me or Hancock, or like you said, Charles Berlitz, or other people outside of these specialized professions, like, dares ask a question like, okay, well, how were the pyramids built? It's like, you dare not ask that question. Okay, we don't know, we don't have a goddamn clue, but how dare you ask that question? You know, it's like, well, the burden of proof then is on you, because to me, this idea that reality defaults to skepticism, which has become a new thing,
Yeah.
is entirely ridiculous, and it's self-ideological. You know, it's like the skeptics, as I say in the book, apparently have not read, you know, Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolution. They actually believe in objective reality. They don't believe paradigms, even scientific paradigms, are themselves the products of culture and socioeconomic conditions, and that there is no such thing as purely objective science. And this is not a debatable point. Thomas Kuhn conclusively proved that in the 70s. So it's like, I find it funny that anybody that tries to advance the field, be it archaeology, ancient history, whatever, is considered crazy now. And it almost presumes like, well, then I guess we figured it all out then. You know, why are we even talking then? You must have an answer then. But they still cannot answer basic questions, you know? And to me, it's like, well, then you don't have an answer. And if we can answer those questions, even if we have to use esoteric, quote unquote, information that aligns with physical information or myths or linguistic similarities, as I show in the book, well, then if it's based on evidence, then we're winning. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're not winning just because you don't want to hear it. And I think that's something that, you know, Hancock has proven many times over. You know, they bitch and moan all they want, but it's like, well, where's your counter argument besides you're mad, or he's a racist, or he's crazy, or whatever the hell it is that week? It's like, those are not sophisticated counter arguments. You know, you haven't written a debunking book that goes point through point the way he has written a book, or many other people, you know, Berlitz, or, you know, Daniken, von Daniken, and these people, or whoever, you know. And so I don't even really engage with people unless they're going to engage with me on a level of respect, but also of professionalism. Like, if you have a problem with, and I haven't gotten any of this, except for one person actually in Britain, of all places, who's mad at me, you know, Tony.
Is it you, Ben? No.
Yeah,
Tony.
It's not Tony in the chat, is it?
Tony
No.
and Britain.
Oh, we know Tony, surely. How many Tonys can there be in England?
There's an old man that's very mad at me because I dare use esoteric sources, and I don't believe that Atlantis is in the Mediterranean, because it's not, and there's no evidence. And he wrote a book on it, and he's mad that my book's selling more copies and went to #1.
That's it.
But it's fascinating because it's like, well, if you have a problem with me, then write a point-by-point refutation going through every source and show me where I'm wrong, because I'll go back into Amazon KDP and I'll amend that and I'll give you credit for it, you know? But it's like, that's not what I got. I got ad hominem attack that we all know how people feel about esoteric sources. You know, it's like, well, no, we don't actually, because we haven't pulled the entire world. And then, you know, saying outright that archaeology categorically rejects the year 9600 BC for the reality of civilization. It's like, so the entire field of archaeology, really? So Gobekli Tepe doesn't exist? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's very convenient that discovery hasn't given more credibility to this 9600 date Plato gives. It's like, we have an advanced observatory in Turkey that is at least 12,000 years old, maybe older, and has only been excavated, I think, 10% of it, of the temple complex.
I think it might be 5.
I think it's 5, yeah. And
Yeah,
same with
Katahoya. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's like, so we have that. That's cool, because we have a physical thing that we can see and people can walk around it. But somehow it's impossible that, like, that level of sophistication or higher could have existed on an island off the coast of Portugal. Like, why is that impossible? I really, it's really strange to me, because even before I studied this subject, I wasn't strongly for or against it. I was just like, I don't know anything about it, and I'm going to go into this investigation just blind. I'm going to actually see where this leads. And as I did the work, I would waver. I'd be like, this isn't a book. Wait, this is a book. This isn't a lead. This is a lead. This is a bad channeling source. This is a great channeling source. And let's standardize this and show people where you came to these conclusions, instead of just saying, like my friend Rob Nealand, who's an actual archaeologist, says sometimes, Michael, don't just tell people you had a girlfriend that had a past life in Atlantis. They don't want to hear that. They want something a little more substantial than that. And I said, well, Rob, I never talked about my girlfriend with a past life in Atlantis, but I see what he's talking about, because, a lot of these esoteric type books, they don't use references. They don't cite sources. They just say, etc. So I tried to avoid that, while at the same time using unconventional means to, round the picture out.
Now we mentioned the sources. Before we're recording again, I think I mentioned that personally I wasn't familiar with Edgar Cayce. I just knew the name and sort of a bit of the reputation surrounding him and what time he was living in. I knew that he was a famous clairvoyant and healer of some repute. So why don't you tell us a bit about him? Tell us about Edgar Cayce.
Yeah, he was a guy who, he was born in the late 19th century in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. And around 1901, he lost his voice. He had a rare case, I think it was meningitis. And a friend told him, hey, you should go see this guy who's coming to town, who's a traveling hypnotist. And they had a couple sessions. He got better, was able to actually speak when he was under hypnosis, but then once he came out of it, he lost his voice again. So that guy referred him to another hypnotist who actually cured Cayce. And while he was curing him, he said, you actually probably have this gift, because I don't really have to tell you much, and you seem to be able to automatically, put yourself in a hypnagogic state. And so this guy became his kind of little, promoter around Hopkinsville. And that's how Cayce discovered, around the age of, I think, 24, 25, this ability. And it became so powerful that, because he was giving medical advice, he was healing people, he was giving remedies, that actually, I include in the book, the people that came to visit him. They sent a psychiatrist from Harvard who, was hell-bent on debunking him, and he couldn't. And then, later I show a psychiatrist who was a student at the time from the University of Chicago, and he interned with Cayce the last couple of years of his life and documented everything he saw. And he said, I could never understand this, but I had to believe it was real, because I was watching this guy, locate missing objects, locate mineral deposits, like to the inch of where he said, like, you're going to find silt if you drill here, then ore, then iron, then this. And he's like, I swear to God, the people went out there, drilled, and that's exactly what they found. So it kind of shocked this guy who was an atheist, hardcore materialist. And during this time, all these people started to see this pattern emerge, where he would give past life readings, and sometimes he'd take you back 3, 4 lives, sometimes 5. And it seemed to be that the people that happened to be coming to him, whether it was karmically, they were drawn to him or whatever, all eventually, many of them, 500 of his clients, roughly, or 500 readings, some were multiple readings with the same client, went back to this period called the Atlantean experience. And, this was in the 20s and the 30s mainly, that he gave the Atlantis readings, when, there had been books written on this, but it was not a widely popular topic. And the dates he was giving for some of the more conventional history were absolutely crazy to people who were even, interested in Egyptology, when he said, conclusively, the Great Pyramid of Giza was built in 10,490 BC, and it took 100 years. It was built by magnetic levitation, and it was built by the descendants of Atlantis who were fleeing the final destruction of their continent, which had also had two more destructions, the first being in the year 50,722 BC. And it's like, people were just like looking at these transcripts like, what are you talking about? You know, like, these are incredible dates for a layperson in the 1930s, you know?
Now
they
then,
didn't have
would he have been familiar with the works of Plato, Michael, do you think?
According to his son, he never read Plato. Now, of course, that's impossible to confirm, you know? And he did have a near photographic memory in waking life. And
wow, that's a rare gift, isn't it?
Yeah. But it's not, even if he had read Plato, I'll give you an example, because I thought about this myself. He could have read Plato. He could have read a lot of things. He could have read The Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly, which was written in 1882, you know, that talked about a lot of theories of Atlantis and where it could be. But here's something I'll give you as a kind of control. He said in 32, he said, did you know, this is in a full hypnagogic trance. He said, did you know that at one time the Nile River, it used to be called the Nile River, and it actually flowed through Central Africa and emptied into the Atlantic Ocean on the Congo end of the country as it exists today. He said that in 1932, and probably somebody just filed it away like, yeah, whatever, buddy. Well, in 1986, satellite and space shuttle imaging radar confirmed that that was true. That there is a giant river underground, 6 feet under the sands of the Sahara Desert, that probably had its origin where the Nile River is, and it empties into the Atlantic Ocean on the Congo end of the country. Now, that's an incredibly good guess for an uneducated man on a couch in Virginia Beach in 1930. Now, this is one of about 20 other things he said that are nearly impossible to guess, you know, that I'll let people read the book to see. But, you know, those are things that really, to me, are significant, you know, let alone the other readings where I said, you know, you can go look one up yourself, where somebody went, I believe, to Bimini drilling for minerals in the 80s based on a Cayce reading. And they said he was accurate to the inch on the core sample from a reading he gave in the 40s on what the mineral deposits would be like on this part of the island of Bimini. And they did a core sample, and they said it was exactly, the strata was exactly what this reading we pulled from the archives was. How could that be? Well, obviously he's in touch with what he would call the Akashic records, or, you know, on some level he could remote view in real time. You know, he was a kind of super viewer because he could go himself into hypnagogic trance and go back in time and accurately see things to a degree. But he could also give contemporary remote viewing sessions in real time, and you could ask him questions, Q&A. And he had a 95% accuracy rate remote diagnosing medical conditions.
That's a good point. Most of these readings were remote, weren't they? There were people writing to him.
All of them. Yeah,
Were they
like
all?
pretty much almost all of them. I mean, there were a handful where somebody would be, like the mother of the child would be in the room with Cayce, but almost all of them were remote, you know? So he wouldn't even know your name. Well, he would know your name, but he wouldn't know anything about your location, where you live, nothing. It would just be, okay, like a remote viewer gets a target, a number, or a series of letters. And he could diagnose, you know, I show a couple in the book, third lumbar, you know, has a slight fissure on this side of the third vertical lumbar. And it's like, these weren't just random guesses, because when the person went to the doctor, they said, who told you this? Because that's exactly what's wrong with you. And we missed it on your checkup? Like, did you see an expert? And they're like, no, I saw an old man on a couch in Virginia. And, you know, and he went to jail twice, actually, because he was, you know, considered to be practicing medicine without a license.
Wow, this is reminiscent of the man Reich, isn't it? Wilhelm Reich. That's how they.
Yeah.
I think that's how they got him in the end.
It is, and they stole his machine, you know, and the what is it called? The
Cloudbuster.
The
orgone accumulator.
No, the microscope that could see living blood.
Oh,
I don't know. Blanking.
Spectroscope, some kind of, I forget what it's called, but yeah, but you know, and I talk about that briefly, like, because you're right, this was the time when, you know, the Flexner report came out and the Rockefeller pharmaceutical complex started to get really going, and Cayce was caught in the middle of that, you know, where they were shutting down not just him but all holistic practitioners, chiropractic, yoga. It was all outlawed. You had to have a AMA license to do any of this stuff.
Well, that was a great observation you made in the book about that's the American Medical Association, is it? And this is right. The sort of banning of anything other than allopathic medicine.
Correct. Yeah. And of course, Rockefeller built and bought that license. Like, everybody that got a AMA degree had to go through his version of medical school. And he's an industrial manufacturing magnate, so he has extra petroleum and toxic crap to get rid of. And so that's why most of those pharmaceuticals at the beginning were, you know, residue from his other industries was going in as filler and things like this. And so, yeah, that was an interesting, like, side arc, you know, because Cayce's dream was to build this holistic hospital. You know, that's the only reason he ever took money, was to build this. And I think they started building it, but then I think it was like the Depression hit, actually, and by the mid 30s he had to abandon it. And, you know, he became super depressed and was just like, God, how can I not even accomplish this one thing when I'm like a miracle worker? And then he realized later in life, you know, look, there's other ways to, you know, help people, so I'm just going to do it from my home. And a lot of people think that's what killed him, really, was that at the end of his life, he was giving something like 6 readings a day in a state that a doctor who was watching him said was as near a coma as he could be, actually. So he would go into a coma 6 times, you know, from breakfast to dinner, and pull people's life records or give them medical readings. And it took a toll on him, you know, and I think he died at 65 years old. So
that was something I wanted to, well, 2 things I wanted to ask, is what was the financial arrangement? Did he charge for every reading throughout his life? And also, how many readings in total do we think that he did over
15? Yeah, he did 15,000 readings.
Right. Over several decades?
Over 40 years,
right,
basically. Yeah, over the course of about 40 years. And he died in 1945, January, I think, 1945. And yeah, I mean, occasionally he did ask, you know, some of his richer benefactors, because again, he wasn't just being seen by average people. You're talking about Harry Houdini came, Nikola Tesla got a reading from him, Woodrow Wilson got a reading, Henry Ford got a reading, you know. And I mean, so it wasn't just some quack. I mean, he was considered one of the, you know, premier clairvoyants in the United States when this subject wasn't as ridiculed, you know.
It was going through a renaissance, if anything, because this is around the time of Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, and
right,
Steiner is probably around that time as well, isn't he?
He died, I believe, in when did Rudolf Steiner die? I believe he was dead before
World War II, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was. I think he died in the 20s or maybe the early 30s. I'd have to check that. But, you know, Steiner was really active around the turn of the century. You know, some of his biggest lectures were like 1901, before World War I, and then after World War I, he got really active with the whole Ahriman stuff and all that. But you know, again, it's funny because it wasn't just Cayce. You know, Cayce had a contemporary who was even in a weird way stranger than him. I think his name was Osewicki. He was a Polish guy he actually died the same year Cayce died, except he was machine gunned by a Nazi firing squad. But he was visited, just to confirm your point, you know, he was, according to an eyewitness account that's very reliable, one of the, I believe it was one of the Rothschilds had lost this extremely valuable collection of family papers, and they couldn't find it. They sent spies, they sent private investigators. Well, somebody told them, look, there's this guy in Poland who can find anything and is a full vetted clairvoyant. And according to his wife, they were visited by a private plane. I think this was in the 30s. And one of the Rothschild barons appeared and said, were the papers, it was just a brief conversation. He said, were the papers stolen? And Osewicki said, yes. He said, who stole them? He said, the wife of your butler. And they said, where are they? He said, they're still in London. That guy went back, found the damn papers, and then wrote this guy a blank check. So he got a blank check from the Rothschilds that he claimed he just threw away. He's, I don't want your money. I'm just glad I could help somebody. But, you know, it just shows you that, I mean, if the most powerful people in the world are going to a psychic in Poland or a psychic in the United States, then, you know, if they tell you it's BS, it's probably because it works. And, you know, they didn't want you to use these things because they're kind of like superpowers, you know?
There's a famous quote somewhere, and it might just be a meme, but it's something like, millionaires don't go to astrologers, but billionaires do.
Yes, that is I've heard that.
Don't know where
I've heard. That's so funny. I've heard the same thing. I don't know where the origin is either, but it's like millionaires don't use astrology, but billionaires do. Yeah, or don't believe in astrology or something like that. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. I just wanted to touch on one of the other main focuses of your book, which is Frederick Oliver and the book that he wrote. I think it's important to talk about him because this is a crazy story when you start, because you quote, you know, good chunks of the story in the book, and you're trying to put together in your head that this 17-year-old kid is writing this book. It's just it's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, honestly, that was too weird for even me. I had a couple times where I really had to stop for a good 6-7 months because that book was so personally kind of, I really can't explain it. I don't know if I even want to talk about it, but I had just a few experiences with that book where I felt like this is so real. And it's almost like there were parts of the book where I felt like it was exactly describing my own life at the time. It was very weird. I don't really want to get into it, but
wow.
Yeah, to answer that question, you know, how do you even begin? I mean, you have a 17-year-old kid living in Eureka, California, next to Mount Shasta, famous, you know, mysterious sacred site. And, you know, in 1886 in the Wild West, who claims to come home one day and start automatically writing forwards and backwards, might I add, a 450-page Shakespearean script that mirrors Star Wars. The only problem is, you know, it's 100 years before that franchise was conceived. But it's talking about being on a ship that can move through the air fast and go underwater, and talking to a princess on a holographic projector, you know, while you're fighting basically the Sith and you're dealing with the Jedi, except you call them the Sons of Solitude and, you know, the Sons of Belial. But it's essentially Star Wars, but channeled by a 17-year-old kid who had no formal education. and it's set in Atlantis in the year 11,160 BC. So it's quite strange. It's not for everyone.
Doesn't he describe some sort of handheld device that they all had as well?
Yeah, he describes a cell phone that's holographic. He describes it, calls it a name, NAIM.
Like a mirror. Does he describe it as like a mirror?
Yeah, it's a handheld mirror. It's a black mirror that can holographically project your friends. The only problem is he's a kid who lives. Yeah, the only problem is
this thing here, this black mirror that's handheld.
I know, yeah.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah, and I mean, where did he get this? Where did he get his theory of the sun that he spends 2 full pages describing what the sun really is? Where did he get his theory on what cathodicity really is, what magnetism is, I mean, it's so weird that the first time I read it, I said, this has to have been like, where's the part of the book? I'm going to read it again so I could see like where Nikola Tesla wrote like, hey, just kidding, I wrote this.
Right, because there's like physics and engineering and all sorts in it. Yeah.
I mean, I almost want to read a passage from it, if I can. I don't have it in front of me, but it's beyond the level. Like, there is no 17-year-old, like Einstein at 17 could not have written some of the passages from this, nor Tesla, nor Shakespeare. Like, there is no 17-year-old kid that writes at this level. It's impossible. Yeah. Unless he's the greatest writer in the English language. But then the question remains, well, he wrote this at 17. He died 16 years later at the age of 33. And his mom didn't publish the book until 1904. So if you had written something this crazy for sensationalism, you just put it in a drawer and you didn't share it with anybody. So there's no motivation for sensationalism. There's no motivation for one day I'll be the greatest undiscovered fiction writer. Like, his mother had to take a bunch of notes and bring it to some, publisher in 1904 that was like, what do you want me to do with this? And pay them a lot of money to standardize it, figure out which page went where, because a lot of it was out of order, and then release it to a very small group of, local bookstores until it was later republished in like 1925 en masse. But again, it's like, what's the motive? If this is fake, which this is a great work of fiction. You go on Amazon, this is a great work of channeled fiction. It's like, once again, just like Plato, this is not fiction. Frederick Oliver specifically states that this is a true account of my friend Philos's life in Atlantis in the year 11,160 BC on the island of Poseid. And this is how it begins. And what I tell people is, I only had maybe 2 moments where I damn near fell out of my chair or quit the project. And one of them was when he includes just casually in the middle of this book, there just is a blank page and then there's a map. And he says, this is the island of Poseid. This is where I used to live. And I looked at it like, okay, like whatever. It's a triangular shape. Okay, cool. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? Then you look at the mid-Atlantic ridge and you turn that shape. You don't change the shape. You just tilt it and you superimpose it where the Azores are today. And it's an exact fit. And the problem is that was not known until the 40s. When he wrote that book, there was one map of the mid-Atlantic because they did soundings 10 years before that book came out. They took a sailing ship with steam power perhaps and used ropes to find out how deep it was. But they didn't know what the exact contours of the miles of the mid-Atlantic ridge looked like. There is no map. So when you look at a modern satellite map, and it's exactly the map he channeled and drew in 1886, again, that's when I was just creeped out because it's like, oh my God, this is true. Like, even though you thought it was true, it is true. And therefore, you got to sit down for a minute and like take a break from all this shit because you're going to go crazy.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. I took about a year off, actually. After I found that map, I closed the project, I saved the file, and I just, went about my life because it was creeping me out when I saw, when I would, for fun as a skeptic, cross-check everything he said that I could, get a data point on. If he said that, this is what South America looked like, I'd be like, yeah, right. No, it didn't. And then you wait a minute. What? Or he'd say, this is what we called this thing. And you're like, okay, you're just making up words. And then you actually find an etymological, like logic in his own Atlantean language that he occasionally uses. And that's, again, I just got creeped out and I shut it down.
That was one of the most compelling parts of your book, actually, was the sort of etymological analysis, if that's even a phrase, when you were looking at sort of ancient Inca or Mexican, South America, Central American words and sort of similarities and analogues between those words and words that were in the Frederick Oliver book when he's describing channeling Phylos. Was it Phylos of Atlantis?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so weird. And exactly. I mean, there are, for that to be a forgery, it's like, that's crazier than it just being true. If that makes sense.
Yep.
Because even if you consider, which I have, and I say in the book, let's just pretend that Nikola Tesla wrote that. Well, then the latest it could have gone to print with final editions was 1904. There's still no map of what the bottom of the Azores looked like in 1904. So that alone is incredibly bizarre. There's also very little knowledge at that time of this cataclysm that we now all but take for granted after the work of, Hancock popularizing it and James Kennett with the nano diamonds and everything in 2008. This idea that there was a cataclysm around 10,000, 10,500 BC is now, more palatable. But to say that in 1886 is quite uncommon to just arbitrarily pick a date like, yeah, this was my past life in 11,160 BC. You know what I mean? It's like, and then he says, and then the civilization lasted about another 800 years. And it's like, okay, well, that's bringing us almost exactly to the time when most people think this comet, the first of the fragments or whatever, this cataclysm began. And you look in the geological record, and there was something going on at that time. So it's like, again, how does a 17-year-old kid and a 65-year-old man, neither of whom have education, one is in a clairaudient waking automatic writing session that's like interfering with his school sessions and his parents are worried about him, and the other is an old man on a couch in Virginia, and they've never communicated, and yet they're saying the same thing. It's in an age when nobody was communicating across those distances unless they absolutely had to or knew about each other. So it's like, it's very unusual, but there it is nonetheless. And so I really tried to, bring these stories to people in a way that wasn't just silly or disrespectful, but to show, hey, plug these into the other evidence and see where things line up.
You mentioned earlier that with Edgar Cayce, he had an illness. Was it some sort of meningitis maybe that seemed to trigger his abilities, for lack of a better word? Is there a similar thing happening with Oliver? Is there like a documented event in his life that started this process? And has there been sort of any decent biographies been written about him?
No. In fact, I looked for almost a whole month straight just on what you just said. There's only 2 pictures of him. I mean, maybe there's more in in the National Archive or something, but probably not, because photographs are still extremely rare unless you're a very, wealthy person, even in 1886. But I did find a portrait of him as a kid and a portrait of him as I think like a 25-year-old. And I included one of them in the book, but autobiographical information, actually, it's all in the preface to his own book, where he describes, like, I came out here from Washington, D.C. with my parents. I never had a formal education. I consider myself an atheist, but I was raised Protestant. So that's really all we have to go on. And I don't even think anybody knows what he died of. He just is listed in, I think, Los Angeles as deceased in 1899 at the age of 33. You know, so again, I don't even know. There's very little information on this kid, but what he says in that intro was just one day he started getting this feeling like somebody was talking to him, not while he was asleep, like while he was just out journaling or, you know, mining or going for a walk by Mount Shasta. And he said it started to interfere with, like, my parents would be talking to me like, Frederick, dinner's ready. And he's like, I'm channeling a book on Atlantis. Like, I can't talk right now. And he even admits, you know, in his like 19th century humor, you know, he's so humble, but he's like, you know, like, I did the best I could to like honor my mother and father who, you know, were justified in their skepticism, my occult preceptor who was in my head. And it's like, you know, but they just looked at him like, okay, my son is schizophrenic or something like that. And it doesn't seem to be like hurting him. He's still a teenager. Maybe he's just eccentric, or he's like pretending he's hearing voices, but, you know, we'll take a look and, oh, that's cute. He's writing like a fantasy novel, they probably thought, you know. But I guess after enough time went by, probably his mother or father actually read the thing and were like, what was that? Like, are you kidding me? You know, like the same way I read it and was just like what? Like, I had heard about this book, but like most people, you hear about it or you read a summary of it, but you don't actually sit down and do what I read that book 7 times straight to see what the hell is really going on in here. And by the 3rd time, I figured it out. And by the 4th time, I started to be able to like really go deep into the chronology of what was going on and then corroborate that with, you know, the other sources, even Plato, you know. And he fills in some things that Plato wasn't aware of. Like, he has a name for the circular river. And I think I'm the first person in the world maybe that ever noticed that, where it's one word in a, you know, many 1,000-page book that people usually don't read. And he says, you know, we had a great time going around the circular Nomis River that circled the capital, you know, and he has even a name for the capital that Plato didn't have, you know. So you start to just take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and you kind of overlay it and see, like, where does it line up? And, you know, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, I don't say, you know, if you buy this book, you'll find Atlantis. Yeah, it's not what I'm even trying to do. My goal was to say, look, this is the heavy lifting research I've done as a professional historian who was just curious. And, you know, perhaps this will lead to more discussion of a topic that's really endless, you know, because if this was a civilization, as Edgar Cayce says, that lasted 90,000 years, I mean, what are you going to find that's conclusive of anything, you know? Like, Edgar Cayce's son once said, famously, he said, look, if you fast forward to the year 14,000, after a cataclysm has destroyed the United States, tidal waves, and the whole United States is underwater, and you fast forward to the year 14,000, and a guy comes along and drills a 4-inch hole in the bottom of the ocean over New York, are you going to find Manhattan? Are you going to find the United Center where Beyonce played in Chicago? Are you going to know anything about our culture that's like not even stored in physical records anymore? It's all just in hard drives that are software contingent, or we don't even build megalithic architecture, you know? So probably the only thing that would be left would be like the Hoover Dam, you know, which is like one of our few megalithic type structures. But like the Empire State Building wouldn't be there. There'd be zero evidence of this discussion or the possibility that we had holographic mirrors and we could talk across oceans. It's like, so why is it hard to think that if you go that same distance backwards, if you want to look at it just for argument's sake in a linear fashion, that couldn't have been the case and then been destroyed? And then, like, what are you going to find? You're not going to find a Atlantean iPhone 10, but you are going to find, you know, megalithic architecture, linguistic links, archaeological evidence that doesn't add up, you know? And so it's almost like I get annoyed when people, you know, particularly with this, the new flavor of the week, you know, the Eye of the Sahara. I get tired of this. Let's just take that, for example, just as a baseline. I'm not saying that was not possibly an Atlantean city. It could have been a natural formation. That's irrelevant. It just shows me that people don't even know what the hell they're looking for, because it's like, just in Plato's dialogue, he's describing an enormous island, probably 1.5 times the size of Spain, off the coast of Portugal, in front of the Straits of Gibraltar, that also had neighboring islands and a dominion that extended to the North American continent, which somehow he was aware of in 360 BC.
The opposite continent, he calls it.
The opposite continent.
Yeah.
And that this empire also had dominion all through the Mediterranean up to Egypt. So when people are like, look at this circular city, it's like, the circular city was in the capital. It wasn't Atlantis. It's like if you found the, I don't know, like Central Park, and it's like, we found the United States. It's like, no, you found Central Park in New York, in the country within the empire of United States in 2023, you know? So I think people should just start using more precise language. Like, I'm neutral on the Rishat structure. You know, I look at the Eye of the Sahara. I know, you know, Jimmy Corsetti and people like that they've made a career. Like, they've gone on Joe Rogan. I found it. And I found a Roman map, and look. And it's like, look, that's a very viable, do your research. Like, it's a strange structure regardless if it's natural or human made. But to say that that's Atlantis, it's just kind of like, what are you talking about? Atlantis was a global culture according to Plato and all the evidence from Edgar Cayce, you know?
Yeah.
It wasn't a circular city that, you know, was the most powerful circular city in the world. And once you find that, that's the
and
end
just
of the
stayed there.
story.
They were just happy just staying there in that couple of
Right.
square miles.
They wouldn't
want to, you know, take over anywhere else or anything like that. That's not anything to do with human nature, is it?
Exactly. And it's so funny to me, because it's like, I don't think they've read the dialogue, you know, because when people even say like, well, what did Egypt have to do with Atlantis? It's like, did you read the dialogue? Who the fuck told Plato the story? It wasn't another Greek person. It was the Egyptians telling Solon, who told Plato. And then in that story, they talk about a global cataclysm where a comet burns up everything on Earth. And again, it's like, how did they know that in 360 BC? And then they said the date that happened was 9006. It's like, so they're describing an event that many cultures around the world have described around that same time, you know? And I think it's disingenuous and it's insulting to these otherwise, you know, people we consider geniuses, you know, we would never say that anything else Plato said is BS and made up. It's like he is considered one of the great geniuses of Western philosophy, and yet, he's wrong there.
Yeah.
And so to me, that says more about the people looking at it. Because I'm fully prepared to, if somebody can refute anything, and I really mean this, like, it makes my investigation better because I'm not invested in finding this thing, because it's not something you're gonna find. It's just it's like saying, well, when are we gonna find the Roman Empire? How come we never found it? Like, you keep talking about the Roman Empire. Where is it? It's like, well, there's the Colosseum. It's like, no, but where's the Roman Empire?
Yeah, it's an
and
abstraction.
It's like, what are you talking about? It's like, yeah. I mean, we can't even find Alexander the Great's tomb.
Right, yeah.
I mean, think about that.
There is an argument. I don't believe it, but there are people who argue that the evidence for the existence of Alexander isn't that strong. I tend to disagree, but people make that argument, because we don't have a body.
Right. And, and I mean, don't even get me started on, I won't insult your audience. I won't take it to Netflix Cleopatra.
Oh,
we won't go there.
Oh, fuck.
But
we'll save that for part 2.
Yeah. Well, I'm waiting for the Idris Elba as Alexander. That's going to be the next one they're going to do probably. But, I think...
hey, as long as it's not a documentary, I'm fine with it. But don't call it a documentary.
That's the thing. That's exactly the point that I think is absurd. It's like, you're free to use a Chinese woman to play Cleopatra if you like, but that's not a documentary. And the Egyptian government has every right to be like, please find somebody that's closer to Ptolemaic Cleopatra, please. That would be nice. But again, it's just, that's okay. But how dare you look for Atlantis, But, I think it's just like you said, we debate things that are much more contemporary, and we don't have even to take the case of Alexander just briefly, the best account of him from Ptolemy himself, Cleopatra's great granddaddy, that was lost. That was lost in the Library of Alexandria.
Yeah.
Right. So that was supposed to be the greatest account firsthand from his companion in the cavalry. We don't even have that. So I think it was Arion that wrote the definitive history of Alexander, but that was written in Roman times, like 400 years later. So, I mean, he was not a firsthand account of that time period. He was going off Ptolemy's records that we can't see. So it's all it's much looser than people think. But I think it's like you said, it's like we get to a point where, well, that's good enough. So we'll roll with that, but with a topic like this, I think people are less averse, or they're more averse, because whether or not Alexander looked like this or did that or won Gaugamela with this tactic, it doesn't change the fundamental kind of course that we are comfortable with, which is that, people were primitive and we have iPhones and we're the best. The Atlantis story is a humbling story, because it's like, not only were we much more advanced, in many ways, technologically, spiritually, but that in Cayce's story, we blew ourselves up twice. And then the comet came in and finished off the world. Yeah. And that's legitimately terrifying, so I understand. I think that's the main obstacle is psychological and human and academic arrogance, not the lack of evidence,
Cool. Well, Michael, we've blown over an hour already. I don't know where the time goes, but anything you want to say before we play ourselves out?
No, I just appreciate. I hope I haven't offended too many people.
I doubt it.
No.
But I try to read my hosts, and you guys seem pretty cool.
Unoffendable.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, you seem like nice people that aren't, you know, full of shit. So I try to match that myself. But no, I really appreciate it. And, you know, I'm glad that, you know, of all the things, and I don't even look at it like as a, like, I mean, that sounds very rude. Of all the compliments you could have given me, I don't, I don't mean that, but of all the things that you could have said about the book, like I like this, or I thought this was cool, or I didn't, what you said actually, that's the one personally that I think makes me feel the best. It is not that I love the pictures or I loved your writing or whatever. It's like I like that you let me make up my own mind. I thought that that's really at the end of the day what my goal was, and that's so cool that you felt that way. That's really nice.
No problem. And I think it'll push people on to do more research as well. It's like, I want to get that Frederick Oliver book and read it now, you know, off the back of reading the accounts in your work. So
yeah, don't take my word for it. Read that book.
Yeah, I want
and,
to. Yeah.
You know, read it and, you know, have a nervous breakdown, you know, have a friend on emergency dial when you're reading that one.
Not me.
No, not you. Well, Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure. The links are in the show notes, as always, if you want to get a copy of the book or visit Michael's website, michaelleflem.com.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Stay on the line for us for 1 minute while we play ourselves out, Michael. And
Absolutely.
The rest of you in YouTube land, we'll be back in 10, 15 minutes for part 2, do some news and some wacky stuff.
Nice.
All right.
Cheers, Michael.
Okay.
Thanks, Michael. See you soon.
Hey, take care, guys. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.